Hey everyone, welcome back to Valley Baptist University, and in this series, A Defense of Christian Belief. This is segment number 8 in this big section that we're calling the existence of God. This is the last segment of the existence of God section, and I'm calling this, What About Deism, or A Case for Miracles. Now, I hope you get a chance to see the previous segments of this series up until this point, because what we've looked at is that based primarily on natural theology, or what's sometimes called general revelation, this is outside of Holy Scriptures like the biblical New Testament, but this is implied in the New Testament in places like Romans 1 in the Christian Scriptures, where it says that which can be known of God, at least in a limited way in nature as well as within us, including our consciences, can be known in general revelation. So right now, I just want to say there are people who will come to this point and say, okay, so it's reasonable to affirm a kind of single prime mover being who's maybe even intelligent, but this God simply has no interaction with what this God has caused, or I cannot accept that. This fits into the general framework of what is called deism. Now, there are many that would even up until this point say whatever has been said so far, that's purely just for the ignorant. Only the unlearned would even hold to a deistic God. Well, I want to challenge you on that. As we've looked at before, there was a long-time Oxford scholar, atheist champion, Antony Flew, who debated on the subject of the existence of God all over the world. And just a number of years ago, before he died, he dropped a bombshell book called There Is a God. And that was looking at some of the arguments that we've looked at in this series up until this point. In fact, keep in mind the well-known Oxford scientist and longtime antagonist to Christianity, Professor Richard Dawkins, has actually publicly conceded October the 21st in 2008 in a debate with John Lennox at the Museum of Natural History of Oxford. He said a serious case can be made for a deistic God. And he said the same thing to Justin Brierley in an interview after the debate. So whatever terminology someone is using, this is essentially a description of deism. This is from Norm Geisler and his Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. He says, deism is the belief in a God who made the world, but who never interrupts its operations with supernatural events. I've had definitions like this challenge, so for those that would challenge that, this is from my own copy of the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, copyright 1995. By the late 18th century, the term deism came to mean belief in an absentee God who creates the world, ordains its laws, and then leaves it to its own devices. In fact, some have described deism as God minus miracles. I relate to what William Lane Craig, the famous philosopher and debater, writes. He says, I've been surprised to find how often deistic thinking underlies the flowering dialogue between science and religion in the contemporary scene. And the point he's making is that commonly these days there can be kind of a nod to God, but not to a God who can or does perform miracles. In fact, it seemed to me like in many ways deism is almost becoming like the new atheism. I've personally run across many who would describe themselves with the term atheist, but then in dialogue and conversation, working through definitions, they seem to reveal and even concede that their position reflects a definition of deism. So let's go back, and again, I hope you will watch all of the previous segments, but here's just a brief recap on theism up to the point of what we would call a deistic God. So using abductive reasoning or inference to the best explanation, a case can be made that since there is something rather than nothing, then inference can be made to a transcendent cause. Cosmologically, that might relate to the Kalam or even the contingency argument. And so evidence such as fine-tuning in DNA information infers the first cause is intelligent. Evidence from our own consciousness infers the first cause is also conscious and is even a personal being, is a self. And evidence from our own intrinsic sense of moral obligation infers there's an ultimate standard of morality, that morality isn't purely relative with no intrinsic oughts or ought-nots, and thus this transcendent first cause is intelligent, conscious, personal, and moral. So, right there, thus, the Christian theist thinker sees inferred from this premise, and this is maybe the most important premise that we're going to look at in this segment. We're going to keep returning to this. I call this the God factor. This premise, number one, if a God exists, miracles are possible or even expected. Again, if a God exists, miracles are possible or even expected. So historically, there have been at least two main thinkers who opposed this premise. One is, I'm calling this letter A, Benedict Spinoza, and this refers to Benedict Spinoza's pantheism. Spinoza lived in the 1600s. He was born to Portuguese Jewish parents in Amsterdam. He was actually disfellowshipped from his Jewish synagogue because of his position that God is extended, which is a form of pantheism. Now, we've looked at this subject before, but as a recap, pantheism is the concept that God is identical with the universe, that God is not transcendent. Some Christian thinkers call that monism or oneism. And so what you have with Spinoza is just by ruling out God as twoism in advance, he just ends up question begging. He assumes the conclusion from the beginning and then reasons from there without really providing convincing argument for his beginning supposition. What you could call this is a presupposition. So this is a nature equals God universe. And in a nature equals God universe, sure, miracles simply don't happen. There's nothing outside of the universe that can come into the universe and cause something miraculous. And you could say it's all miraculous. Now, we've already done some contrasting on pantheism to the inferences that we've looked at in previous segments of this study, but also I did an entire series called Christianity versus the New Spirituality that also talks a lot about pantheism. What I believe people will find if they really do their research and think objectively is that nature does not equal God, but that God transcends nature. In fact, that's what we've inferred coming up to this point. So I'm not going to belabor this too much more, but I want to add this. The brilliant physicist Albert Einstein, who came up with the general theory of relativity, predicted an expanding universe, which by implication is that at one point the universe had a beginning. And Einstein pushed back on this. In fact, it was astrophysicist Robert Jastrow who wrote that Einstein, after even being corrected by a colleague saying, Dr. Einstein, if you extrapolate this, you realize that the universe is expanding, which means that there is a beginning. Well, Einstein said this circumstance of the expanding universe irritated me. And so Jastrow asks the question, well, why was Einstein so irritated? Well, he said his conclusion and answer came in understanding that Einstein's irritation came from his religious belief in Spinoza's God. Sometimes we don't think that a scientist or a physicist would draw a conclusion based on a personal, biased, even a religious understanding. But we saw that even in Albert Einstein, and he and other physicists sort of came kicking and screaming in the last century into this framework that the universe actually did have a beginning. In fact, Dr. Geisler says it this way: the evidence has mounted for a unique beginning of the space-time universe, and thus the Spinozan hypothesis that God equals universe is falsified. So let's go back to that premise. Once again, the God factor, the initial premise. If a God, or we could say now, if a transcendent God exists, miracles are possible or even expected. So the main thinker, however, quoted to oppose this premise is the Scottish philosopher David Hume. So according to David Hume, and I want to summarize his views. This is a very simple summarization. For David Hume, miracles are pre-scientific, they are violations of the laws of nature, and including that, they are also too highly improbable to accept. Now, I want to say, if deism is the new atheism, deferring to Hume is like the trademark move of the deist, and for many who would rightly classify themselves as atheists or agnostics. So let's break these down one at a time of David Hume's views. First, is the acceptance of miracles merely a pre-scientific way of thinking? Now, we all know that science has advanced, and what people thought was something years ago, even some generations ago, is different than now. But is that purely the way people thought about all supernatural interaction? Let's just give one example from the New Testament scriptures. As you come to a time of the year we call Christmas, there's a Christmas account in the New Testament. It features two characters most have heard of. Their names are Joseph and Mary. And if you know the account in the New Testament scriptures, Joseph seeks to put away Mary. Why? Because Mary was pregnant, and Joseph knew, if you're hearing me, he knew scientifically or biologically where babies come from, and he knew he wasn't the father. Now, that's simple and rudimentary, but that gives just one example that even though their scientific biological understandings were limited, people of New Testament times knew that virgins don't conceive and give birth without any kind of outward interference, and they also knew that dead people don't just rise up and walk. And we're going to get to that a little more later in this series and the importance of that. So we've asked the question, is that just pre-scientific? No, you can't say that's merely pre-scientific. Here's another point that Hume makes, and we're going to look at this. Are miracles violations of nature? As many have stated, Dr. William Lane Craig, Dr. John Lennox, many others, a theistic view really doesn't assert a violation of natural laws, but instead it asserts an intervening variable. You could put it this way: natural laws hold sway under normal natural circumstances with no interference. Theism, on the other hand, is an assertion that there is a transcendent interference, i.e., or meaning God. Somebody who famously defined miracle was the Oxford Don C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles. He says a miracle is an interference, or you could say an intervening with nature by supernatural power. John Lennox, the Oxford scholar, has debated this subject all over the world. He's professor of mathematics and philosophy of science at the University of Oxford. He says this: Newton's law of gravitation predicts what will happen provided there is no change in the conditions under which an experiment is conducted. In other words, you could say that if an object such as an apple is dropped, well, it will fall to the ground unless something or someone intervenes. Now, analogies break down in some ways, but Lennox says if one just admits the existence of a creator, once again, the God factor, If one admits the existence of a creator, the door is inevitably open for the same creator to intervene in the course of nature. In fact, William Lane Craig uses his own personal testimony about this when he came to Christ but still had struggles. And in his book, Reasonable Faith, he said, in my own case, the virgin birth was the stumbling block to my faith. He said, I simply could not believe in such a thing. He says, but when I reflected on the fact that God had created the entire universe, it occurred to me what he was struggling with was, well, genetic material would have to go in the woman's womb. Well, it occurred to me it wouldn't be too difficult for God to create a genetic material necessary for a virgin birth. He says once the non-Christian understands who God is, again, there's the God factor, then the problem of miracles should cease to be a problem for him. Now, the next pushback that's common with Hume, and this is maybe the biggest one, he says is a miraculous explanation of an event is too highly improbable to ever accept. In fact, a summary of Hume's position on this would be something like this. Number one, natural laws are by definition a description of a regular occurrence. Two, a miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. Three, the evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. So Hume in essence says that miracles are too incredible, too highly improbable to ever be supported as the explanation for an event. Now, it is often forgotten. In fact, most that you will talk to or hear from will totally ignore that there are not only Christian thinkers now that push back on this. There were Christian thinkers back in Hume's day who pushed back on this, and most of their arguments have been dismissed or not even read. They didn't even give them a chance to be dismissed. One is Thomas Sherlock, another one is Gottfried Less. Hume arguing that the evidence for the regular is always greater than the rare, both Sherlock and Less noted that if this argument by itself was equally applied, it would eliminate not only miracles, but many natural matters of fact as well. In fact, that would include David Hume's own birth. He was only birthed once. In modern day times, an event that happens one time like a 9/11 event. That's just crazy, but well, it happened because there's evidence for it. Well, someone say, well, at least we have analogies to those. I mean, other people are born and there's other crazy events like Pearl Harbor. Okay, so Dr. Joseph Houston, a PhD from Oxford, he puts it this way. He says on the subject of analogies, he says, if every event must have a known analogy, then people in the tropics before modern technology could never have accepted that ice exists. In fact, Gottfried Less goes on back in Hume's day to surmise that given God's existence, miracles are as possible as any other event. Again, there's the God factor. In fact, the scholar who gets much maligned, typically by people who haven't read him, William Paley, in the 17 and 1800s, he says, the probability, once again, this is what Hume is dealing with. Paley says the probability that God, meaning the God with the attributes that we've just looked at through inference, the probability that God would reveal himself nullifies any inherent improbability in miracles. Even more directly than that, C.S. Lewis, in his book Miracles, with the oft-used subtitle, How God Intervenes in Nature and Human Affairs, Lewis addressed David Hume directly. And Lewis says, commenting on how Hume, instead of evaluating the veracity of the evidence for each miracle claim, he just rules out miracles in advance, believing there's uniform experience against them. Lewis says, now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, in other words, that they have never happened, well, then they never have. Stop right there and think about that. If miracles have never happened, well, then they never have. That's an interesting, some would call that a tautology. It's a question begging system. Unfortunately, we know that going back to Lewis, unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports of them to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, he says we are arguing in a circle. This is called leaning on a presupposition, or as Dr. Geisler writes, he says Hume smuggles his conclusion into his premise. Dr. Craig Keener, who has done extensive research on the modern subject and ancient of miracles, he has an earned PhD from Duke. He says there's been many things that have happened that are not typical experience. We do not for that reason deny that they ever happen. Hume's argument is circular. It assumes what it pretends to prove. Now, we could go on with the people who have refuted Hume. In fact, here's just a few. There are astute philosophers from various circles that have come to very similar conclusions to these about Hume's arguments. One of them is Richard Swinburne from Oxford University. In fact, he addresses Hume directly in his book, The Concept of Miracle. Another is the Cambridge University Press book written by Joseph Houston, who addresses Hume directly in the title, Reported Miracles, A Critique of Hume. Another one is John Ehrman. Now, this is not the famous skeptic Bart Ehrman. This is John Ehrman, a PhD from Princeton, who is actually not a Christian. And he's currently a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, but he has a massive pedigree of teaching in countless academia higher institutions. He has a book bluntly titled Hume's Abject Failure. In fact, Ehrman writes, I find it astonishing how well posterity has treated Hume's work of miracles, given how completely the confection collapses under a little probing. In fact, Ehrman says in his book that Hume was able to create the illusion of a powerful argument by maintaining ambiguities in his claims against miracles and by the use of forceful prose and confident pronouncements. You might know the old saying that if you say it louder, it doesn't necessarily make it more true. He goes on to say, and by Hume's liberal doses of sarcasm and irony. Sometimes you think that if you shame your opponent's view, that makes your view more true. Well, neither of those do, because his conclusions just don't match his premises. They're not coherent. So, I see that our original premise, what I consider to be the most important, as remaining standing. Again, think of it with every aspect of it very simply. Number one, if a God, a transcendent God exists, miracles are possible or even expected. Now, some subsidiary questions that people will come to. One question might go like this, just in an everyday conversation. Then why are there not lots of miracles today? Say, like there were in biblical times. Okay, that's a very good question. So number two, I believe this is super important to this, and this is often misperceived. Number two, there is a misperception about the frequency of biblical miracles. In fact, this is pointed out as long ago as William Paley and even beyond. Paley wrote that if the course of nature is the work of an intelligent being, should we not expect that he would vary the course of nature only infrequently at times of great importance? Paley's making a prediction from the inference that we come to from God and asking the question, well, then how often would miracles happen? Only infrequently and at time of great importance. This coheres with our biblical revelation. People have this perception of the Christian Bible and of biblical times as if the Bible records miracles happening all the time. I mean, people wake up and there's this miracle, and then at noontime there's a miracle, and then when the sun goes down, they go to bed, and just every day it's just miracle, miracle, miracle. Now, there are lots of miracles recorded in the Bible. There's roughly around 250, depending on how those get counted. Most of these, though, took place in the lifetimes of just 3 distinct periods. The periods of most of the biblical miracles took place, number 1, during Moses' era, number 2, during Elijah's era, and number 3, during the era of Jesus and the apostles. And as you look at the scriptures, you find that the constant during these eras is that they were pivotal times to God revealing himself for special purposes. There are many that will just not take the time to examine the chronology of the Bible in order to realize that there are actually huge gaps of times, even centuries, when there were no miracles at least recorded as performed by God by the biblical writers. And why? Well, again, because they mostly took place at pivotal times when God was revealing himself for special purposes. In fact, as you look at those with Moses, Elijah, Jesus, and the apostles, they were not only taking place at pivotal times, but also for pivotal people in pivotal locations. It's obvious, hopefully, to us that not everybody who lived on planet Earth during Elijah's days saw Elijah's miracles, and even Jesus and the apostles. So it was not only in a pivotal time, but it was at a pivotal place with pivotal people. So the original premise was, if God exists, miracles are possible, even expected. Well, why don't we see them as much as in biblical times? Number 2, there's a misperception about the frequency of biblical miracles. Now, another subsidiary question that comes from this, why don't we see them then at all in our time? I mean, aren't all the claims today of miracles false, made by a bunch of lunatic, crazy people? I will wholeheartedly admit there are a bunch of crazy people. I have YouTube just like everybody else, and people are claiming that Elvis was healed by aliens and Elvis healed me. It made the cover of Globe magazine. I wholly adhere to that. However, this is what I want to give you as number 3. There is a misperception about the perceived uniformity against miracles in modern times. Somebody says, well, I've never seen or heard of a miracle. Well, where have you looked? Well, nobody I know has ever seen a miracle. Well, who all have you asked? Dr. Craig Keener, again, PhD from Duke, in his book, he has several books that write extensively on this. One is the book Miracles Today. He notes in his book that a 2006 Pew Forum survey of just 10 countries on 4 continents, first off, talking about some who would consider to be fringe in Christianity, but if you hang with me, we're going to show you that it's not. He says, first of all, about 200 million Pentecostal and Protestant charismatics in those countries alone claim to have witnessed divine healing. But not only that, he says some 39% of Christians in those countries who are not Pentecostals or Protestant charismatics also claim to have witnessed divine healing. In fact, he says, in short, hundreds of millions of people around the world claim to have witnessed such experiences. Now, someone will say, well, people around the world and a bunch of religious nuts, they're still primitive. They're not civilized and educated like me. Okay, try this. In a survey by Business Wire, December 20, 2004, Keener notes, nearly 3/4 of doctors in the United States claim they believe in miracles. Stop there and think about that. 3/4 of doctors, if you're in the United States, in your country, believe in miracles. More importantly, he says, over half of the physicians surveyed noted that they had witnessed what they considered to be miracles. Once again, well, I haven't seen one. Where have you looked? Well, everyone I've talked to, who have you asked? There's much evidence with what we're looking at with this, though, and what Keener studies that corresponds to this special purpose as related previously from biblical history. We looked at that subject of a pivotal time. Well, what about pivotal people and a pivotal place? Dr. J.P. Moreland, whom we've had at our church, I consider him almost a friend now. We've had so many conversations. We've had him here twice. He's one of the 50 most influential philosophers living in the world today. He writes in his book, Kingdom Triangle, a major factor in the current Christian revival in the third world, in a pivotal place where they don't have access to the gospel and access many times to medical care. There is a revival in the third world. By some estimates, up to 70% of it is intimately connected to signs and wonders. In fact, Moreland quotes an article in the Washington Times that notes the explosion of Christianity in the underground church of China. He includes this in the article. It says that one of the driving forces of Christianity's growth in China has been associated with healing powers, particularly in rural areas where basic health services are lacking. Lee Strobel, whom we've also had at our church, in his book, The Case for Miracles, interviews Keener, and Keener also concurs with this estimate about China. He says 90% of the growth of the church in China is being fueled by healings, especially in the countryside where inadequate medical facilities exist. He says, referencing others, including Dr. Julia Ma, at the Oxford Center for Mission Studies, Dr. Julia Ma said most converts among the Cancanay in the northern Philippines came to Christ through the experience of miraculous healings. In fact, Keener notes that in Ethiopia, again, these are not groups that we would typically say are holy rollers. In Ethiopia, more than 80% of believers surveyed in a Lutheran church attributed their conversions to miracles. Now, that notwithstanding, I want to go back and end this segment where we started at the beginning. A person will hold, okay, there is a transcendent cause, a prime mover that's perhaps evidentially intelligent, yet some will make the sweeping stance against miracles. Winford Corduan, professor of philosophy and religion at Taylor University, in his book, No Doubt, he frames it this way. He says, I want you to simply think of it this way. Deism has an inconsistency at its core. Two affirmations are at the heart of deism. The first one is, God performed the miracle of creation. And also, two, God does not perform miracles. Now think about that for a second and the incongruency. God performed the miracle of creation too. God does not perform miracles. It's like saying, I accept supernatural cause for the cosmos, but I do not accept supernatural causes. Now, does this mean, again, every miracle claim should be accepted? Of course not. As Dr. Geisler writes, the only way to know for sure is to investigate the evidence for each miracle claim. Assuming that each and every miracle claim is false, though, as Hume does, is just clearly illegitimate. And for the deist, it's incongruent with the original premise of their system. So how now then would we look at the major monotheistic claims of miracles and God revealing himself? How would we compare and contrast them with each other? In other words, as we have now, I believe, adequately ruled out polytheism, pantheism, how would we stack up the major monotheistic religions, say, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and their core verifying revelations? How do they compare and contrast with each other? In other words, someone will ask, okay, so why Christianity? That's what we're going to look at as we begin our second half of a defense of Christian belief. And we'll start that next time with the next segment. God bless you, and I'll see you next time here at Valley Baptist University.